you, sir. The Appropriations Bill is, of course, one of the most significant bills we deal with every year. It appropriates a large sum of money. I think we are heading slowly towards the $20 billion mark for the state government to be able to fund its activities over the coming 12 months. It is, of course, a bill that will be supported by the opposition, as it always is. This year, the Appropriations Bill, the budget papers, contain a number of activities that were undertaken by the previous government but not reported on in previous budgets, obviously, and indeed it fulfils a number of the new government's election commitments and contains some other information. Last week in the Parliament, last sitting week, we had the opportunity to deal with the Supply Bill, which of course deals with that money that is required to run the state until this bill passes. And indeed, next week after estimates, we will then have a third opportunity to talk on matters of this nature when we respond to those estimates committees before ultimately passing over this bill to the Legislative Council. So I absolutely love each and every one of my portfolio areas, but I don't propose to go over the same material in each of those three speeches, much as it would be directly relevant. I thought what I might do instead was last week I talked about early childhood for some 20 minutes. Next week, in response to estimates, I'll probably talk about education, training and skills for the majority of my time in response to estimates. I know that the Education Minister and I are looking forward to a good day together next week, some 6.5 hours of opportunities to go into great detail in the tremendously important range of matters for which he now has the privilege, the honour, and I know he enjoys that honour and takes it seriously. I look forward to going into it in great detail with him then. Today, I thought that I might use this speech to talk about my other portfolio area, that of the Shadow Minister for Arts and Festivals. This is a tremendously important part of what our government does. South Australia is known as the festival state. The fact that the former government, led by Stephen Marshall, who as Premier took on responsibility for the arts portfolio and indeed devolved some programs to Minister Pisoni and myself as Ministers for Industry and Skills, as it was called at that time, then Innovation and Skills, and to me as Minister for Education, was an opportunity for us to share across government, highlighting the important role that those institutions play indeed in our state, in who we are as a state, in the way that we perceive ourselves, in the way that the world perceives us. Our artistic community certainly valued support, significant support from the Marshall Liberal government. It remains to be seen whether the new Malinowskis government will provide anything like the same level of support. I had the privilege to represent the Liberal Party recently at a forum put on by the Arts Industry Council of South Australia, where the new member for Boothby spoke on behalf of the Labor Party. Sarah Hanson-Young, the Senator for the Greens, spoke on behalf of the Greens. An independent candidate, Jo Dyer, spoke about her point of view, and I was able to represent the Liberal Party's point of view. And indeed, I noted that the Greens certainly encouraged by a number of the artists present at that time, had a very significant body of work that they wished the federal government and indeed state governments would sign up to. I noticed the Labor Party spent a lot of time in their talking points talking about how they understood the aspirations of the artistic community that had been put to them and they would look into whether those issues were to be met. We're talking about the precarity of employment, for example. I know one of the Labor Party's election commitments involves investigating long service leave entitlements. There's a number of matters which the Labor Party has signed up to some very fine words that would be appreciated by many in South Australia's artistic, creative and cultural sectors. The proof will be in the pudding and see what they deliver in government. If this budget is a marker of that, then it suggests to me that they will identify some projects that the Premier is keen on. They will commit to those, and they've delivered on those. There's about 4 of them. And but the underlying work, that is indeed what our arts and festivals will be for South Australia in the coming years. It remains very much to be seen whether the level of interest is there. Let me go through what I'm talking about. The government had a promise for boost funding for the Fringe. It's in the order of $2 million. It will, I believe, recruit overseas headline acts and do some other work to support the Fringe in their important work. Of course, the Fringe over the last 2 years is the largest artistic and cultural event in the world. It's usually second, but of course, through the pandemic, the Fringe was able to continue that tremendous work, and it is important for South Australia. And so that's a level of support that the Fringe will receive as an entity. That was the first promise. There's a $2 million boost in terms of grants for artists and artistic production. And indeed, the former Marshall Liberal government spent significant funds on supporting artists, particularly through COVID. There are indeed many, many grants programs through the budget for other sectors as well, and so the arts sector has this boost in grants. And as I said before, there is the portable long service leave entitlements. And I note that in Budget Paper 4, the Arts and Cultural Policy and Support on page 28, the targets identified by the government for what they're hoping to achieve in the arts portfolio include providing that additional investment in the Fringe, providing investment in grants for artists and smaller art organisations. That's, as I say, $2 million each for each of those areas. And then thirdly, work with the sector to address issues relating to work insecurity and income inequality for artists, including investigating the establishment of a portable long service leave scheme for artists. Now, it remains to be seen what they come up with, but if I was an artist who had voted Labor because that was what I was hoping for, the way that is worded would not leave me holding my breath for that to be delivered. But I'm sure that the work, including the investigating the establishment of, will ensure that the department will provide some advice to the government. We'll see how they respond. There are, in fact, 5 further targets listed under the arts portfolio for what the government's seeking to achieve. But all 5 of those, of course, sir, were remaining priorities of the Marshall Liberal government. Important work, and I'm pleased that the new government is continuing that work. But I'll just go through them because I think they're tremendously important to the state of South Australia and who we are and the way we present ourselves. The first of those is Takari, our First Nations Culture Centre, the Centre for First Nations Culture. This is a massive project, so this is a nation-building project on Lot 14, adjacent to Botanic Gardens, where the former government was proposing originally to build flats, and then Jay Weatherill, as Premier, proposed that we have a modern art gallery. The Liberal opposition, as we were then, alongside Stephen Marshall as the leader of the opposition, and I was the Shadow Arts Minister, we thought that there was a higher purpose, indeed, for that part of the site as well. And the idea that we would have a centre that would recognise the histories and the songlines of our world's oldest culture, and here in South Australia, where we have, through our art gallery, our collecting institutions, the museum, and other areas, and indeed through the, they have in those institutions the most extraordinary collection in the world of Aboriginal art and cultural artefacts, but of course in our living Aboriginal culture today, through the work of artists on the APY land, in the southeast, in every corner of this state and in this city, Aboriginal artists are, of course, doing extraordinary, groundbreaking, spectacular work, and indeed telling those stories, telling those songlines, celebrating culture is going to be an amazing opportunity for Takari to add to not just the way that Aboriginal South Australians present culture in South Australia, but indeed in the way that our country engages with that. It'll be a drawcard internationally, sir, I promise you. And indeed the work that the former government did, I'm pleased to see will be continuous. It received some federal government funding, but overall it will be a $200 million project that will enhance our state, it will enhance our nation, and of course it will be tremendously important in the work we do in reconciliation, but also as an icon for our state and our nation. Another very significant project that is underway as a result of investment by the Marshall Liberal government and listed in this budget as one of the targets for 2022-23 is indeed to progress construction of the state-owned cultural institution storage facility. Now that sounds like a fairly dry topic, but I assure all members of this House that at the end of next year, when this project is completed, it will be something that our state should be proud of, and I encourage all members to become familiar with this project. Because the way that our cultural heritage, our Aboriginal cultural heritage, and indeed our migration cultural heritage, the artefacts that form our history and our identity through our art gallery, our museum, our State's History Collection, the collections of the Maritime Museum, the Motor Museum, and indeed particularly the Migration Museum in this context, and indeed a number of other institutions are not held in fit-for-purpose facilities at the moment. We had an event in 2016 or 2017. Jack Snelling was the Arts Minister, and I asked about him in this House whether the government would look into an art and cultural storage collection. He admitted its priority, but it certainly seemed to be very unlikely they would ever do it. This was after an event where priceless artefacts that form part of our South Australian Museum's Cultural Heritage Collection, Aboriginal artefacts, had the sprinkler system turned on them when there was a break-in to the warehouse where these things are kept. And the sprinkler system was turned on to them directly. They weren't stored in appropriate cabinets even within this rented accommodation. It was an opportunity for us to have access for generations to come to these priceless artefacts was potentially denied, and there was damage caused and significant cost in restoring these items. But we owe a duty to Aboriginal South Australians, we owe a duty to future generations of all South Australians to ensure that our cultural history is kept appropriately. We have a collection in the art gallery worth over $1 billion. And to the fact that we know that a small percentage of that is on display at any one time, that's normal museum practice. But what's also normal museum practice is that those that are not on display are kept in climate-controlled conditions that are appropriate for the safe security and storage of those cultural artefacts and artworks. The collection itself, sir, is going to be well in excess of $1 billion worth of materials and artefacts and art that are stored in this location. It was announced, I think it was the 2020 state budget, as a project by the Premier, then Stephen Marshall. And it's a project that I think will be absolutely significant. Hopefully an opportunity for indeed the community to engage with a number of these artefacts which are usually kept locked away in a much more appropriate manner. It's not going to be something with a major visitors centre or anything like that, but it will be an opportunity for those artefacts to be accessed by the community as appropriate on many occasions. And critically, when the museums and cultural institutions and display institutions that have access to those materials, or indeed might gain benefit from loans of those materials, they'll be accessible, they'll be looked after. And indeed, that is a project that will be there for the future, for many years to come. That was a project approaching $90 million, and I'm pleased to hear that it's continuing. I was grateful to the Minister for the Arts today, who was provided a briefing this morning to me, along with her officers, the first of the ministers whom I've sought briefings from, who has responded, and I congratulate and thank her for that briefing. And according to that briefing, I'm advised that the timeline is that the early works, of course, which were looking to be completed, were indeed started in December last year. It will be tendered soon for more major works, construction to start in July this year and completed at the end of 2023. I should say Takari, on the same timetable as advised, we're looking for it to be completed in 2024, late 24, and open to the public in 2025. These are two major institutions, and I look forward to seeing them in place. Of course, another significant body of work undertaken by the Marshall Liberal government when Stephen Marshall, the then Premier, was indeed also the Minister for the Arts, was a fulfilment of our promise at the 2018 election to deliver an arts plan, an arts and cultures plan for South Australia, a body of work that was led by people in the artistic, creative and cultural communities, and indeed not driven by government but driven by them. It was the first significant and substantial plan of its type since Diana Laidlaw was the Arts Minister in the 1990s. It was a process that was very heavily subscribed, supported by many people involved, and indeed there was a very significant level of buy-in from the artistic and cultural and creative sectors in forming those recommendations and supporting them thereafter. We'll be keeping a close watch on how the government progresses the arts plan. I was pleased to hear this morning that one of the recommendations of that arts plan, of course, the development of an Aboriginal arts and cultures plan, an Aboriginal arts strategy rather, which was progressed by the Marshall Liberal government and I think it was last year. Delighted to hear that the new government will be progressing that work and continuing that work. We'll be keeping an eye on it to make sure they do. The remainder of the arts plan, I look forward to testing in estimates potentially next week how much of that work will continue. Because this is not a body of work that was dreamt up by the member for Morialta and the member for Dunstan and imposed on the arts sector. This was a body of work that was created during the term of the last government, led by the arts sector for the whole of the state of South Australia. And there's a significant number of recommendations in that, dozens of recommendations, many of which were supported in principle and which work was either underway, some had been completed, and some work still to do. I'm looking forward, indeed, to seeing the work that's done in relation to the acoustic hall, which I understand the Infrastructure SA processes are still in train, and I commend the government for continuing that exploration. I look forward to seeing what it produces in the months ahead. I think that the really interesting thing in this budget is clearly going to be in those two sections of the budget, one in the Department for Innovation, one in the Department for Premier and Cabinet, identified in the budget papers as savings measures, operating efficiencies. The Department for Premier and Cabinet has, I can advise the House, and it's in Budget Paper 5, and it is page 99, operating efficiencies of $65.8 million. $14.5 million in the coming financial year, then 20.6, 19.7 and 10.8 in the 4 years after that. The Department for Innovation, as is now identified, has operating efficiencies assigned to it of also a very significant stake. Departmental efficiencies of $230,000 in 21-22. I'm sure they'll be able to meet that. Then $20 million in 22-23, $18.9 million in 23-24, 16.3 in 24-25 and 16.5 in 25-26. Now, those two departments don't just include the arts portfolio, obviously, but certainly in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, the arts portfolio is a very significant proportion of the spend. And this is why I come back to what I said at the beginning of the speech. The level of interest shown by the government in this sector, not just dealing with those election promises, the fringe, the arts grants. I should have also included there's $500,000 for the film festival and a series of commitments in live music over the next couple of years. Apart from those, what else is the government going to do? And how much of the artistic and festival cultural fabric that make up this state and what it celebrates and what we present ourselves to the world, how much of that will be nurtured and maintained by this government? These savings in the tens of millions of dollars in those two departments, I fear may lay heavily in the arts portfolio. We will learn more next week. I suggested to the Minister this morning that there's a very high likelihood that might be a higher level question that I'll be asking in the arts program on Thursday of next week. How much of the departmental efficiencies from the DPC, which are 14 million, 20 million, 19 million and 10 million, are going to be applied to her portfolio area in arts? Because my hot tip is the Premier is going to be going in there to bat, I would imagine, for those departmental efficiencies to be more heavily skewed towards those areas that he values less. And we have a sense from the way that he talks about it and the way that the government talks about their budget of where arts and festivals fits in their order of priorities. Now, that's their prerogative. They've been elected to government. They didn't necessarily say that there would be $20 million cuts in areas like this, but they're the government. They have to produce a budget. They have $3 billion worth of election promises to find the funding for. We'll see in the coming months and years how heavily that axe will fall on this sector. But I make the point, this is a sector that I think came after the election to assume that the Labor Party, certainly by their words, certainly by the words in an arts industry forum I spoke at not 2 months ago, were going to be there for them, and I suspect the truth is the exact opposite. We shall see. I look forward to the estimates process. I thank the Minister again for providing me with that briefing on that, and I look forward to engaging in the other portfolio areas when we come back in our estimates replies in a week or two's time.